Hey guys, I'm here with Clayton Jacobson, Jamie Brown, and Jason Byrne, the cast and crew of Brothers Nest, and we're here to talk to them about their new film.
Once you step inside here, you're in. What kind of criminals get caught?
The dumb ones.
You're kidding me.
What's with all the cleaning? You've got like 7 cleans in here.
I saw the film last night, and I really, really enjoyed it. Congratulations on your world premiere. So what was the inspiration behind this story?
There was a very direct moment of inspiration that I can point exactly to the moment it happened. I'd been working with Clay on another script, and he's got a house in the country. I left to go for a walk at the end of the day to get a breath, and as I turned around, it was sunset, and his driveway's got these beautiful trees, but the way the light hit it, they like bright red at a certain time of the year, and it looked like kind of like this beautiful hellish entry. And I just, in my head, I thought, how could you use that in a film? And the idea of having some guys going there to do something bad, and then once you have that kind of light bulb moment, essentially what you're doing after that is sort of academically, intellectually building a story. And I'd always wanted to write something for Clay to direct. We'd been working on a couple of things. I, tend to write generally about male relationships, and once we started to build on things, and I actually wrote it with their real names, in mind, because I was writing in a shared kind of language. We're from the same area and stuff like that. So that was it's a very direct. It's hard with a lot of scripts to recall how you actually fell in love with the idea, but I can remember exactly where I was for this one.
What was it like working with your brother again on another film?
Well, it was great. I mean, Shane and I have, we made a previous film 11 years earlier called Kenny, which played here as well, which became a big hit back in Australia. And at that time, Shane had done some acting, but it was really his first major sort of foray into a strong performance. Well, of course, since then, he's become a household name in Australia and has acted in a lot of television, a lot of film. And so I was actually a little nervous. I thought, is he going to be able to take direction from his big brother now? Right. But it was actually a really wonderful experience. It was the most fun I've had in the industry, without fail. We actually lived together while we were making the film. So we were living in a renovated shipping container in a caravan park. And it was my son was there, who's 22, and he was working on the film, and Shane and myself were staying in the same house. So as I would work on shot lists at night, Shane would cook me roasts in the evening, and we would go through our lines together. So it was a really kind of wonderful time for it's kind of quite ironic, because what happens on screen it sort of gets quite really dark. Yeah. But what was actually happening in real life was actually the complete opposite.
And you couldn't do this film, without you're directing and starring, your brother's in it, we're in a cold place, we were, these performances need to be on. If there wasn't a history of relationships, particularly between you and Shane and, other key crew, but that's why I was confident when I asked him, please direct this and, consider yourself in it, because I knew that he and Shane would kill it.
It's funny because I actually didn't. Right up until about 3 weeks before the shoot, I was always hedging my bets that I might bring someone else in to play me, because the idea of directing and acting in a film and co-producing was a tough call. Luckily for me, when it came to actually shooting the film, Jason was doing the lion's share of the work, and I could concentrate on just directing and acting. But right up until the last minute, I was thinking, I wonder if I should get Angus Sampson to do this, but then I thought, no, it actually will be. It was written for the two of us. I'd love to honour that, and I think also we can, being brothers, we can bring some more meat to it and Shane's 7 years younger than me, so. As you get older, of course, age becomes less important, and we almost feel like twins. But when we were younger, that age group was really pronounced. When I was 14, he was 7, and he was yapping at my heels. And as a 14-year-old, I hated it. Yeah. And I remember my father pulling me aside once and saying, "Clay, the way you're treating your little brother, just know he sort of idolises you at this point, and that doesn't last forever. And if you blow this, you blow it for good." And it was an interesting sort of lesson for me, because there were some tensions between us when we were younger. So we played up on that with this film. We talked about that, and I said, if there's anything, and I'm his older brother, so I have a history of telling him what to do. And I was about to do that as director. Like, the kind of irony of all this is I'm the director, so I get final say. So as the older brother, I had final say, even making this film.
Because I think it hit me last night, you're actually the ultimate writer, your character. Because it's like there's something you want to do that the producer is telling you can't do because it doesn't make any sense. So you back logic it.
Yeah.
You go, this is something you want to do, and then you try and say to Shane, no, this is why you should. And you just run through all the options and see what sells the best.
That's right.
You just like dig a hole
Yeah.
and then figure out a way out. It really struck me last night, like how full of shit you are. Your character is.
That's true.
Your character is.
Yeah, exactly. But it was so that was, and I said to Shane beforehand, I said, let's really bring it to the table. You know, like, if there's anything at all that I've ever done to give you the shits, and I know there is, you know, then really let's use that. Let's bring that to the fore. So it was a wonderful experience, and there were some moments there where I know the crew were looking at us going, is this, you know?
And just from my point of view is, you know, there was nothing, you know, producing with both the boys is, it's nothing better than when you see a great screenplay, but all the pieces falling into place. You have two brothers, they have an emotional language that they understand. And I'd always, knowing that they're good friends, that there would be material between them as two brothers that would come out on screen. And it always plays into the most important thing with a film, and I think we saw it last night, there's an authenticity in this film, and it's from the staging, the original idea, right down to, you know, the dynamic for them on set. Even though it's lovely to talk to, we had this great contrast where it was just such a family and community, and I think it's come out in the reviews today. The irony is we're on stage talking about how magical that experience was, but we're actually shooting a story about mutual self-destruction.
Yeah, and whether you like it or not, it does feel cohesive. Like the script editor that we had, this a kid called Chris Parlow, that, you know, a young filmmaker, great filmmaker, sees everything more through a director's point of view than I would, because I'm the only real pure. I just write, while Clay and Chris, and so I worked early with Chris, you know, before we handed it to Clay, and even he, you know, I mean, he's this very cool guy, you know, he's hip, he's smart. But even he was, you know, he would not only be able to edit material and push me to do better, but he was adding, you know, some original material that was clearly thinking about what Clay needed visually, and also being that hypercritic, going, you know, you're being lazy here, or you need to push this here, and then when we went to Clay with it, he took it up a notch. But, you know, Chris's involvement was really important and something we always want to recognise.
In the film, there were a couple scenes that were very interesting to me. So there's one where Terry kind of sees a beating heart in the wallpaper, and then whenever there was like a blue light going off inside of one of the radios. So could you maybe like talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of scenes where I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But it's you know. The thing that I really loved about the script when I first read it was when I first started reading, this is kind of a fun farce, you know, and a sort of a two-hander. It feels very sort of theatrical in a way, you know, two men sort of in their family home. I love that idea too, the idea of them plotting a murder in their family home. Right. It's just such a twisted and nasty thing, and that's actually one of the things that drew me to it, was that there was a nasty. I see the film as two halves. It's like the first half for me is fantasy and the second half is actually reality. Because the first half is really these two boys sort of caught up in their own fantasy of what they think they will get away with, what they think they will or won't get away with. And I think it's very true of a lot of criminals, that they get caught up in their own fantasy of what they think will transpire. And it's how they obviously get to a point where they feel confident to move forward with something that is ultimately going to be their demise. And then, of course, the second half is the horror of what happens when you actually instigate those things that you imagine. So all I was doing with those scenes that you're referring to was just letting the audience get a sniff that something darker is coming. You know, just and to unsettle them a little bit, to not get them into a position where they were just feeling comfortable with. I always wanted to have something there that would just trigger a sense that there's more going on here. And also I think the thing you're referring to is that these walls, this house that they've lived in all their life, these walls will remember everything that happens today. That was the point of that.
And for any like filmmaking students. Like, this is an interesting example. This is the way writer and directors can work. I remember we would always talk about how do we make that first half. We give it a little bit of colour, give it a bit of zing. I was always, thinking, we can get the horse more involved. We could do, this. And Clay came up with this idea that I just thought was like I didn't understand it. Yeah. It just sounded insane until he started doing tests, and that's where I think your written work starts to elevate into something that hopefully becomes a great film. Because I remember being so not convinced about this other element, but that took the film to another level, which was interesting but challenging at first, till you see it sort of executed.
Yeah. And it isn't meant to be completely understood. Yeah. It's meant to be just give you a feeling of the diversity of their minds, of just where their heads are at that point. And they're both focusing on two different things. I mean, Terry's character is completely consumed with what will go wrong today and what doesn't make sense, and his own sense of humanity, whereas Jeff is just maniacally, going through the plotting that he has spent, obviously, weeks and weeks, an idiot, weeks and weeks, watching YouTube videos and reading sort of, crime manuals. I had a really interesting, we did some test screenings back in Australia, and I had some really fantastic, what I love about this film is it does generate really interesting responses from audiences. So I had a woman come up in tears, like just absolutely riddled with tears, and she could barely get it out, but she said, "Your film is so true. I've just been through this." And I'm thinking, really? And what she was referring, and she said, "Yeah, you've got to make it more dramatic. You've got to make it more." So I appreciate that, but the film's finished. And what she was referring to was that thing of when there is a death in the family, and this is what I really loved about the story, is the hierarchy that exists between siblings is set in motion very, very early on in your life, and it remains forever. And when one of those characters either dies or the matriarch or patriarch is lost from that equation, that whole dynamic goes into this weird flux. Yeah. And from my experience of watching a lot of friends that have lost family members, it can often get really ugly when it's about deciphering what happens with the estate. Who pays who gets the favourite watch, or that's my sofa, not yours. Yeah. Like over really silly things. So I found that really, really, really fascinating. And but I had one woman come up and she said, "Watching your film is like having dinner at my house." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "I'm a forensic psychologist, and my husband is a homicide detective." And she said, "The way you have portrayed these two boys is very much like a lot of the clients that we deal with, that they do live in this fantasy land, and they are so acutely unaware of their own limitations in their thinking." So that was an interesting sort of compliment, but I did love that someone that worked in that field could kind of recognise the truth of what we were getting at.
So did you guys talk to anybody in that field beforehand when you were doing research for this movie?
What we did was, in terms of research, no, because we
You
kind
spent
of...
a lot of time with criminals, though, in the past.
I have, but professionally, not in their profession, in mine. I do a lot of criminal TV. And they do talk, a lot about, they always think they have the secret. But it needed to be written a little bit from that, like it's got jokes in there about DNA under the fingernails. Junkies are really messy. Ice junkies, that's what my dad says. The box cutter thing is just an image that you seem to see every time a grocery store gets robbed. So we did a bit, but stuff that Clay's character needs to represent a little bit of, I think, what the writer is doing, where he's going, someone says, "What about the DNA?" Often you'll have, say, someone at the studio ask you a question like, "But wouldn't you worry in the script, does it make sense that there would be DNA?" And I know I would go, "Yeah, but that's old DNA, not new DNA." And that's the sort of bullshit that Clay's character does. So there needs to be a little bit of innocence. But yeah, I have spent a lot of time with criminals, and that is the sort of thing that they do. They always, no one thinks they're going to get caught. And Clay, I mean, Jeff's character, the Jeff character, he is not only convinced, I mean, he is rock solid certain, to the point where he knows something's going to go wrong, but he's absolutely sure he can handle it. So I love his confidence. But he's my favourite character. He's evil, but he's awesome, I reckon. It's just he doesn't use his powers for good.
Yeah, and I also think that one of the reasons why I didn't go seeking sort of much, because I love research, but I didn't want to go into the criminal side because these guys aren't criminals. That was the point of it. They are a couple of, they've never done, as one of my characters says, the worst I've ever done is a dodgy tax return. And so the way I always saw it when I was thinking about the film and talking to it with Shane, it's like, imagine this isn't a murder and I'm just trying to convince you to help me buy a car that you really don't want to have anything to do with. I wanted people to be able to relate to this film, to see their own. I had another, one of the other screenings I had, a woman come up and she just said, "You're my older sister." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And she spent the entire film just relating to that dynamic. And so I think that was I'm just always acutely aware that the crimes that we see on film, more often than not, they're the sort of top 5 to 3% of crimes that take place. The majority of crimes that happen in the world are domestic. The majority of murders are actually husbands and wives. Dysfunctional families, brothers killing brothers. It's and I really believe that what we've got in this film is probably very accurate to how these crimes happen, where they talk themselves into a frenzy, and before you know it, they're actually doing the thing that they probably 2 years earlier would never have considered, and they find themselves in a horror. I had a good friend I went to school with that he was a brilliant student and a really great guy, but he just got involved in drugs and went down a weird path and ended up getting done on murder, and we were all shocked when we heard about it because it just seemed so out of character. But he had obviously got into a situation where he found himself with a number of people that could convincingly arm him with enough confidence to do something that was deplorable, and there was lunacy involved. They tried to dump the body in a sleeping bag in the local river while there were families having a barbecue in broad daylight. So so it's just there is a comic edge to sort of the most horrific crimes as well. And I think I'm unashamedly paying homage to the Coen brothers in the film from time to time because I love that about their films too. They seem to really rejoice in showing the crimes of fools, and it's just fun. It's fun to go into that world.
And it would have been a difficult world to go into if we didn't finance it the way we did. Because if we were getting notes from a studio or big investors, I think there is a lot of stuff that we wouldn't have been able to do.
No, exactly.
So, the way you guys financed it was, I think, really fascinating and kind of very old-fashioned, but, it could be something, that will be awesome in the future, if you want to mention it.
Do you want to talk about that? We did finance the film in an interesting sort of way.
Sure. Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's the psychology of the film is interesting. That inherent psychology of the film plays into. We did come up with a sort of interesting way to. There's a psychology really behind how we finance the film in a way, and sort of metaphorically speaking, we went out to we identified that a lot of the regional exhibitors around Australia weren't being given a voice in the process, like due to the larger studio-based finance system, which in Australia it exists in its own parallel form as well. So we went out to regional mums and dads who own a number, in some cases up to half a dozen cinemas, and invited them to be principal partners in the film, and asked them to contribute money to the film against their perceived box office. So interesting, again, another contrast. There's this wonderful community that we built around the film based on their actually coming on board in our first steps, really on conceptually understanding the film, not reading the screenplay or anything, but just loving the fact that Shane was attached to the film, and he's had a lot of box office success. So that's kind of it. And we updated them through the process. We developed a really intimate relationship with them, and so they feel very much part of the process. And for us as well, we're also building a slate of projects. So it's actually about transferring that support and loyalty. Another, what is loyalty? It's the theme of the film. Onto the next project.
So you mentioned a few people in Australia reacting to your film. Has anyone here come up to you and talked to you about it, or?
Well, it's only had its first screening last night, so it was exciting. I mean, I love South by Southwest. It is such a great city and such a great festival, and the Alamo's cinemas I don't know what it is. When someone walks into one of those theatres, it just transforms you into a whole different kind of patron. It just primes you so well for whatever film you're going to see. So the audience, we were great. We had a full house, which was terrific because Spielberg had his film. We only found out about 4 or 5 hours before that he was going to be premiering his film. So we went, okay, so there's going to be. So we thought we won't be having any reviewers at our film, but we did, which was great. What was really terrific was we had a full house, and they seemed to respond really, really well to the film. In all the
respond to you differently depending on what role you are.
Yes.
Like I get a lot of kind of questions like, "Are you sick in the head? Like, how could you do that? How did you feel guilty when you came up with that? Killing the mum? Did you have terrible relations? Did you, is that like?" Do you think about that stuff? They would ask you different questions, I imagine.
I get a weird look.
Yeah, exactly.